All right, folks. Well, you know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Reid, Blubsterini in the home game and at Rec Poker Jim on the hellscape that we call Twitter. And I have the best freaking job in the world, talking poker with my friends here on the Strategy Forums edition of the podcast every Monday night while we steal each other's chips in the free nightly home game. Now, I have to mention that we're brought to you by Running Aces. They are the official sponsor of the Rec Poker Podcast, and they're located less than an hour north of the Twin Cities in the beautiful state of Minnesota. Find out more about them at runaces.com. And most of what we do here is free. We're a largely volunteer-based organization, so we really depend on support from our sponsors and from our premium members who take part in our training material and study opportunities for only $22 a month. Now, you can sign up for free. Everything here starts with a free account at RecPoker, and all you need to join is an email address and a smile, although we do insist on both. But you can get your first month of premium membership for only $5 by using the code RecPoker at checkout, and I encourage you to do so. And I'll just remind all our listeners that if $22 or $5 seems like a lot, I get it. We'll also credit you with a free month of Rec Poker Premium membership if you make a donation of any amount to a local food bank and just let us know about that. So nothing would make us happier than to support you supporting a local food bank by getting you more involved with Rec Poker. All right, now they let me host the show on Mondays, but I'm just one man. It takes a group, a gang, a crew to make all the magic happen around here. We call this group of wizards the RECing Crew because we're all big dorks and love puns. And if you want to learn more about me or the rest of the RECing Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew or listen up because you're going to meet a few of them right here tonight on the show.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I'm PetVet33 on social platforms and Fergie56 in the home game. And I run a hand history review on the second Wednesday of the month.
Yeah, I'm Rob Washington. You can find me as Rabman50 just about everywhere. And on the first and third Wednesdays of every month, you can join me and a group of premium members as we discuss the latest books about poker.
I'm Taylor Moss. You can find me on Twitter at Taylor_Moss or as Gopher Boy TJM in the Rec Poker home game, which I stream live on Twitch Wednesday evenings at twitch.tv/RecPoker.
Well, regular listeners will know that every week we take a strategy post from our free forums here on the website and talk about it here on the air. We've actually really recently been upping our Discord game. We've built a bunch of new cool features into our Discord channel. So I'd encourage folks, if you go to rec.poker/Discord, you can check out all our amazing new infrastructure there. We're going to talk about one of the hands, one of the many hands that folks have posted in our hand review section there. This one is from Bone Crusher 14, who I happen to know is excellent gentleman and longtime member, Marcel Dusyk. So Marcel writes, it's the second level of a live tournament. The levels are 100, 200 with no ante. The hero is in middle position and opens to 600 with pocket kings. The button and the big blind call. So the flop is Jack of clubs, 5 of hearts, 6 of hearts, and it folds to us. The question that Marcel brings to the group is what size of c-bet should hero use here? Smaller because of multiway and the gap between the high card and the others on the board, or a larger c-bet because of the dynamic state of the flop having both a straight draw and a flush draw available on the board. So I'll just start the conversation by just telling our audience. So talking about a dynamic quality to the flop, what that basically means, you can have a dynamic flop or a static flop. People used to kind of refer to this as wet and dry boards. And on a dynamic board, basically what we're saying is that the hand that is currently the best hand is not likely to remain the best hand. Over the course of the turn in the river, cards are going to come that are going to change the nuts at a high frequency. And so it is a dynamic board. On Jack 5-6 with 2 hearts, hearts can make flushes. 7s, 8s, 9s, 4s, 3s, 2s can all make straights. That means that if you've got ace jack on jack 5 6 two-tone, that's your top pair is not likely to remain the strongest hand by the end of the hand. Whereas on a board, I don't know, let's say like, jack 5 2 monotone, you're much more likely to remain in the lead if you have the strongest hand on the flop. So uh, I do get this kind of sense a lot, and I'm curious to hear what the panel has to say about this. Competing factors, right? We're in these spots a lot where we have these general rules like Marcel is referencing here. How do we decide which ones to prioritize in a spot like this? So, like Marcel points out, typically we size down when we're out of position. Typically we size down when we're multi-way, but typically we size up on these kind of wet dynamic boards when we have the betting aggression and we are going to continue betting. Um, how do you guys sort of decide which way to turn when the wind's blowing in a bunch of different directions, Rob?
First thing I want to know is what kind of opponent is on the button.
Hmm.
The player the player, in a multi-way situation, you have to think about, you have to uh, lend your strategy towards the one person and not both people. You want to do this against the button because he has position on you. He's obviously going to have the stronger range because he's on the button. Then the big blind is going to be much wider, typically. I mean, if you look at starting hand ranges, the big blind is going to be wider than the button. The button has the button. That means he can be loose. He can also have more hands because he's on the button. Is he the kind of guy that is going to limp a lot or call a lot of two bets with a wide range? Or is he more the kind of guy that's going to call with ace king? You know what I mean? He's not going to three bet ace king. He's a passive player. He just wants to see flops. What kind of player is he? In general, though, I want to look the button as my main opponent and almost forget about the big blind unless he gets snaky.
Yeah, Kim?
I agree with that. But I think theory would have us a lot of times we're checking a large portion of our range when we're out of position
Hmm.
on these flops. So if we are going to exploitively bet here, we want to probably bet big because we're going to be checking a lot. So, I mean, what are we doing with ace king? What are we doing with,
Hmm.
pocket tens on a jack high flop? What are we?
Hmm.
So we want to we in general in multi-way pots and in when we're out of position, we're going to have a higher checking range than we would have if we were just against the big blind, for instance.
That's a great point because we're talking about, the size of our C bet, but the other question is how often should we be C betting? And typically, if we're C betting at a high frequency, as in if we're C betting with a lot of our range, we tend to size down. And if we're C betting less frequently, less often, even though it's still with a polarized, balanced part of our range, if we're doing it less often, then we're going to choose a larger sizing. Another way to think about that would be if the board is dynamic and wet like this, we should choose a bigger sizing to charge our opponents more. And because we've chosen a bigger sizing, we should see bet at a smaller frequency. So there should be fewer checks there should be more checks on dynamic boards and there should be more checks out of position. So great point there. Yeah, Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a lot of things, and it still kind of gets to the point, I think, of this question that's like, how do you take all these different dynamic pieces of a specific hand and boil it down to what I should be doing? Like, I hear a lot of these things like, okay, I should have a wide checking range, but is this a hand that falls into one that I want to be betting? And it can be tough. So I think when I'm thinking about these spots, a lot of the stuff I'm trying to think through is like, a base scenario. And I think Rob laid out the base scenario. We don't do a lot of studying and a lot of solver work that shows multi-way spots. So we have to figure out how are we going to generally approach this multi-way. So I view this as a starting point of me versus the button. because the button's going to have the stronger range of the two players here. And I'm going to decide, what do I want to do? I'm going to be out of position versus them. How am I going to start? What do I generally want to be betting or checking in this spot? And then for sizing, you have to think, okay, how dynamic is this board? The things that you talked about at the onset of this, Jim, like how often is a hand going to be changing and how valuable it is in the rankings? Another way of putting that is like, how vulnerable is my hand and how much protection do I need in this specific spot? You don't generally like bet for protection, but protection is, a reason to choose a specific sizing over another, or kind of how you view decisions within the hand. So you have to decide, like, this hand is more vulnerable than another hand that I might have within this. Therefore, it leans more towards betting in this spot. Or, hey, this is a hand that may be ranked similar, but it's not as vulnerable as a different type of hand. Because you may look at this, the hand was flop was Jack of clubs, 5 of hearts, 6 of hearts. Ace Jack of hearts is not very vulnerable here. And if we have that, I think that leans a lot more towards, checking, not needing to place too aggressive, but a hand like pocket queens, which is better than a pair of jacks, is more vulnerable here. It can lose to a lot of different things within this hand. So those are the types of things that we should be thinking about. Like, where's my hand? How do I think about my need for protection, my bet sizing? And then lastly, the other component that I like to think through is, like, what is my opponent actually going to be calling me with here? And how variable are they going to be to my bet sizing? If I bet small, are they going to call? And I would much rather they not. So maybe it should benefit towards bigger sizing, or vice versa, and kind of deciding from that aspect. That goes really similar to the, like, range protection. Do I want to be betting this flop a lot or a little? It kind of goes related to that. So those are all the things that I'm considering when I'm looking at a flop like this.
And of course, it's even more complicated. We're talking about generally how we are playing our entire range, right? Like we're talking about the portion of our range that is going to be betting here. So it's valuable to be thoughtful about different hands in our betting range are going to have different incentives, like Taylor's talking about there. Um, it's even possible we try and keep it simple mostly on the Rec Poker podcast, and we sort of try and say, okay, so like have a standardized size that you would be using in these spots so that you don't give away any information about the strength of your hand. But, lots of players could have two different sizes that they use here for different hands in their range, ones that benefit more from protection and ones that benefit less from protection, or other factors that they're considering. Um, Certainly, like Taylor points out, certain hands kind of are more worried about turns and rivers. They really prefer calls, even if they're not necessarily, or sorry, they really prefer folds, is what I mean to say. Even if they're not strictly bluffs, it's very valuable to just win the pot here. Claim 100% of the equity of the pot, even though you're only owed a third of it. Rob, you unmuted there as well.
Yeah, everything sounds really, really good. The one thing I keep coming back to is, do we want to build a pot?
Hmm.
Do we want to build a pot? And then we have to say, okay, with pocket kings, there's only one overcard I have to worry about coming on the turn. Obviously, there's a lot of other draws and everything, but if you're concerned about every single flush draw and every single straight draw, you'll never bet. You'll just check and hope to make a hand that beats one of those. You don't want to, that you can't do that. So you want to get some value. Now, are these opponents the kind of opponents that are going to call down with a bad flush draw? Are they going to call down with a bad gut shot? Are they going to call down with a jack no kicker hand? Are they going to call those against a big bet, or are they going to fold to a big bet with those hands? The next then you have to look at, okay, I want to get value. I've got these kings. I mean, there's not a lot of hands I'm worried about them having right now, other than a set, right? So there's very few. I don't believe there's very many two pairs in this thing. Maybe a 5, 6 of clubs. I mean, there's very few of them. There's very few Jack fives, Jack sixes. So the only really thing I'm worried about is a set, and you're going to find out about a set real quick. So
Hmm.
I think we can bet small here to try to get value from those hands that would normally fold.
Mhm. Mhm.
I might bet big with a garbage hand to try to get those hands to fold. But
Yeah.
here I've got such a strong hand. I want to get some money in the pot. I don't want to blow them off there just because they have to have a straight draw or a flush draw. Doesn't mean I need to blow them off of that. That just means I can get value from it.
I like the way, Rob, you're thinking about like what hands does our opponent have that we want them to call or that we want them to fold, and like how can we contort their continuing range by the size of our bet? Because that is essentially what we're talking about doing here. Taylor?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it'd be curious to see what people think in terms of what they mean when they say a small bet size or a medium
Hmm.
bet size or a bigger bet size. Because I think this is a really interesting spot. It was early in a live tournament. It was raised to three big blinds. You had the button and the big blind call. Let's just assume it was a big blind ante as well. So there's 10 big blinds in the middle. Like in your like how you view this, like with 10 big blinds in the middle and a three-way hand, like what would be a small bet, what would be a medium-sized bet, and what would be a big bet? Because I think that's somewhat curious too. Because if we just speak in generalities, what I might say for a medium-sized bet might be your small bet.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay.
Um,
30,
yeah,
I'd
Rob.
say a small bet is going to be a quarter to 33% of the pot. So we're looking at like three to three and a half, maybe four at the most would be a small bet. I don't know that I have a medium bet. I probably have just a small or a large. And my
Hmm.
large bet's probably going to be in the two-thirds to three-quarters size pot or pot size.
Yeah. Okay, so
Those would be my definitions.
that's
I'm not
where we're
I'm
gonna
not
differ
over
then.
I'm not
Yeah.
over betting here, that's for sure.
To me, when I think about this and like the generalities of a normal heads up pot, I think you're hitting on like the bigger sizing in a normal pot would be like three-fourths pot, something like that. Then you potentially have pot and over betting. To me and multi-way, all those shift down. So like my big bet is something like five big blinds here. And like that's how I view it, and that's where I would be leaning for a bet size if I had a same three-way pot, different board texture that would make me want to bet small, I'd probably bet 2.5 big blinds as my small bet size. So very much on the bottom end of like what you're talking about. So I think with multi-way pots, we can always kind of shift our bet sizes down, and that's something we can be a little bit more comfortable with. And then also just like open up our checking range as well here. But that put to the side, I'm in favor of my large bet, about half pot here, um, because the button range that will continue is made up a lot of pairs of jacks. And I really want to try and get value from that. And then what the big blind is going to continue with is a lot of straight draws and a lot of flush draws. Again, another one that I want to like get some money in the pot with, and I want to go a little bit bigger. I think they're going to be relatively inelastic to sizing. That's the word I was trying to think of before, and then totally like brain farted on. But like how elastic they are, like I don't think this is too elastic. Where all of a sudden you're like, maybe some hands that might be a little bit weary with that is like 9-7 that has like a gut shot straight draw. But I'd rather just like start putting some chips in the middle, and if they've got a jack, okay, let's go.
And we also haven't talked about, I think often when we talk about checking, there's this kind of notion that we're just like not proceeding with the hand. We're kind of giving up. But check raises are a thing. And like anytime that we're considering a C bet, we should consider some of those hands going into a check raising range as well. So we have to think about who is this villain on the button? This is what Rob mentioned the very first time, right? If we do check, are we going to induce from them a bet that they might not make otherwise, with a hand that they might fold to a bet, or maybe the only way that we're going to get some chips in the middle from them is if they're the aggressor. Um, and then I'm kind of curious. I know this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but in a spot like that, let's say we do check and this opponent bets on on the flop. Is pocket kings a call? Is it a check raise on Jack 6-5 two-tone? I don't think it's a fold, especially when we take the line of kind of trying to get the bet out there. Rob, you had unmuted earlier. You don't have to answer that question, whatever you were going to say.
Or what I was going to say is when Taylor and I were talking about bet sizing, Taylor's big bet was kind of like what my small bet was. Because
Yeah,
I
it was
was
your
saying
medium bet.
somewhere between 3 to 4 big blinds, and he's saying, well, 5 is his big bet. So I guess I don't have a small bet here. But if I did, it, it would probably be 2 to 2.5 big blinds, like Taylor said.
And
So
is
my bet would be a smaller bet, but I liked what you're talking about with the potential of inducing your opponent to bet into you when you have a very, very strong hand like you have. So that makes a lot of sense. And maybe by checking, we can do that because we haven't really talked about checking yet. But
hmm
checking might be the way to go here. Because the question was, what's my C bet size? Well,
right.
it wasn't should I C bet? It was what's my C bet size? So I think checking to induce an aggressive opponent, if you understand that your opponent is aggressive enough to make that type of play, rather than just check back and try to, gain some more equity, then yeah, I think a check raise makes a lot of sense.
And for our audience at home, there's about 10 big blinds in the pot right now. So when these folks are talking about, 2 to 3 big blinds, 4 to 5 big blinds, think of that proportionally of a pot that has 10 big blinds in it right now. We opened to three, got called by the button, got called by the big blind, and there's one from the small blind and no antes. That's how we got to 10. Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, you had asked the question around like if we check here, would kings fall as like a check call or a check raise? To me, it's a bit dependent on stack size, which I feel a bit remiss that
Mm.
I didn't like chat about when we talk about like stack size, because
Hmm.
part of this is kind of like, how much are we threatening stacks? Um where are our opponents going to feel different pressure points? So the fact that we're deeper stacked here gives me a little bit of pause. If we were shorter or medium stacked, again, I'm assuming we're short or
Yeah,
deeper
it's
stacked,
early. It's early in the
level two
tournament, so
of
that
a
makes sense.
tournament. Um, because I don't want to go bust with just a pair of kings, but I have a really strong hand. And if this was, for 40 big blinds, yeah, I'm shoveling chips in, like I'm ready to go with this. But if you start doing that deep stacked, all you're going to get called usually is against flush draws. And then, how do you want to take that risk? I'm personally all right with it. It sounds great to me. But it is something to be considered around the stack size and what pressure that's going to put on your opponent. How willing are they going to be to call off with Queen Jack here? They're not going to be that willing, 100, 200 big blinds deep. They might be willing to do that with like ace four of hearts, though, because they know they've still got some equity.
Mhm. And we picked this hand intentionally because it really depends on who your opponents are. Uh, the range of the player on the button who called and got to the flop, you know, their what's the now you got me tripping on words, Taylor. Their preferences, how aggressive are they going to be post flop? Are they going to take bluff spots like that? The player in the big blind, are what's their check raising philosophy? Because this is the sort of thing where it really does matter, and we kind of chose this hand in particular because even if you've got two players, I hear this a lot from coaching clients who say like, "Oh, well, this player is super wide. They could totally have two pair here." Um, so, I should be careful because they have 5-6 in their range. And I just want to push back on that a little bit because if they have 5-6, like they also have all the other combos. Like wide ranges, it's true, they cover boards well, but they very infrequently hit those boards. They've got a lot more combos in their range that miss Jack 5-6 than they do that hit it. Now, it's true that if you were like, if it was an under the gun opener who only plays the top 5% of hands, yeah, Jack 5-6 two-tone, their range is kind of capped there, but they still have some very strong hands. They're going to miss this board a lot, but they can still have some very strong hands. These wide ranges, like button calls from loose players and blind defends, yeah, they're going to hit this with some frequency, but they're also going to miss it way, way more often. So, um, it really, yeah, I don't think we're going to actually answer the question, I guess is what I'm saying. But that's fine because what the real question is like, how do we decide? So we've kind of put a good argument out, I think, for a small bet that captures a lot of our opponent's weaker hands, that allows them to continue with a weak range so that we can win more chips on a future street. We've talked about good arguments for a big bet that target the stronger parts of our opponent's range, like their Jack X hands. And then we've talked about checking. Um, they all sound good. And I think in the Discord chat here, like there's a lot of people weighing in here. LFC, Craig Savage, Chris Jones, Eric Anderson, Hawks Matt. There's just like a bunch of people, and everyone has a thoughtful response, and there's a lot of disagreement in here about what's the right way to proceed. So this kind of gets at that question, like you can rationalize any decision, but how do we decide like what's actually the best decision here? Taylor, you unmuted first back there.
Yeah, I was gonna talk for a bit because we haven't really discussed it. We had mentioned it briefly, but it's like, what are the other hands that in this spot I would also want to be betting with?
Yep.
And try to think about like how would other hands react? Like I think it's probably safe to say we'd react relatively similar in this hand. If we had queens or kings, those are probably going to be acting about the same. But if we have tens, we're going to think about this hand very differently because that jack being on the board. Same with, any lower pairs. A lot of our broadways exist out there for opens that we have, and they don't really connect with us unless we have a jack in those Broadway openings. So it's like we have a lot of hands that are just like really like medium strength. And I think it was Kim that talked about this right away, but it's like, hey, if we have a lot of hands that are medium strength and they're all like not too keen on betting, then we probably go a little bit like, check a wide part of our range. And then when we do bet, we bet bigger. And for that reason, I really like the bigger sizing here. When we start to think about the other construction of our range and what the other hands want to do, because we'll get into other situations where it's like, hey, I just want to bet this all the time because I think we're just way ahead of our opponents. And then you like size down with some of our sizing. So I didn't really answer the question before. I've talked about all the different pieces, but like to me, it's a pretty clear bigger bet in my opinion here, because we're not going to have a whole lot of hands that we want to bet here. And we're going to want to bet some things that got some equity, some things that have no equity. And then these ones that I think the Kings has a ton of equity here. And we want to start getting value from it.
Rob?
The main thing that I keep going back to is, what is my opponent like?
Mm-hmm.
Does my opponent understand when I'm in balance or out of balance? Does my opponent understand what it means when I bet big versus when I bet small? So you need to look at the level of the tournament, because we probably don't have enough hands on them to make those determinations, but there is a player pool, a tendency for the player pool for that size of tournament. He didn't say what size the tournament was, so we don't know that it's, probably not a $10,000 buy-in, I wouldn't think. It's probably more
Right.
like a local casino daily type tournament. So I think the player pool in general is going to be, the word Taylor was looking for earlier, very inelastic to our bet sizing. So I think going through all this and coming through going through that logic process I just went through, I have to agree with Taylor that I think we can definitely bet bigger here because of the player pool and the player pool's tendencies.
And then in that case, for Taylor and Rob, you're every time we make a decision, every time we take an action, unless we're doing it with our entire range, we're splitting our range. So we're saying one part of our range proceeds as a larger bet here. So the rest of our range is checking, and are we are we holding back some combos for check raises there so that we can have, balanced, so we're not always exploitable, we're not always weak when we fold, oh sorry, when we check. Um so what are some good let's just give our audience an easy answer here. It's like, so what are some good check raising combos in on a board like this?
It depends.
Of course. Yeah, hashtag it depends.
I
Sorry,
love it.
you wanted a
Yeah.
nice, concise answer. I mean, it's
Yeah.
tough. I mean, yeah, like a solver's gonna like split a lot of things and do things at mixed frequencies to keep things strong within that checking range. That's really tough for us humans to do at the right rhythm to figure out what that should look like. But I think good check raising hands will exist from hands that have like two hearts in them,
Mhm.
and specifically ones that potentially have a jack in them, because the jack is the club on the board here. So, like, I probably want to put some of those like strong flush draws into my checking range. Not all of them. Some weaker ones I'll probably want to hold on to, and then me having the ace of hearts would be a big thing in determining whether I'm going to check or bet here. And then I might check all my no heart combos of different pieces too. Because I would like to hold some blocking hearts when I'm betting so that I know that I'm not going to get check raised in certain spots. So me having the ace of hearts in my mind leans a little bit more towards betting than it does checking or check raising. But you'll see a lot of like mixed results when you look at solvers with things like that. And it's really tough to like split it up and look at those. But I think those are the types of things you have to think about. Maybe I don't have it right. Maybe I'm screwing up. You should be doing these with hearts and these with no hearts and stuff like that. But it's like those types of things I think you want to think about.
Yeah, I
Rob?
was going to say hands that I would like to put in my potential check raising would be hands like Taylor just mentioned. The the big ace suited, ace of hearts suited, those are going to be in that range. The middle hearts are probably going to be not only flush draws, but they're going to be probably very close to having
Mm,
straight draws also,
good
right?
point.
Because
Yeah.
if I mean, you're opening, so you're not opening, you might open 8, 9 of hearts, right? So you've got a gut shot to the to the
To the
straight
straight
flush,
flush.
right? So, or you got a flush draw and a straight draw. So those hands would make excellent checks because they could withstand pressure that we might receive from the button or the big blind after the turn. But so those are the types of hands I think I would put in my checking range. Are those big heart, ace hearts, ace of hearts, ace hearts suited, ace X reg suited, and you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. Kim?
Well, I mean, if we're going to put all those hands into our check raising range, we have to put some really strong hands in our check raising range as well. So to me, those would be hands like maybe pocket sixes, aces, pocket sixes, because we open up that our opponents could have a jack now. We don't block the jack at all. So maybe sixes and fives, I'm not sure. Aces and maybe kings can go into that range too. But we have maybe just the aces. I mean, I don't know uh how many really strong hands we have to have there compared to the bluffs, but we have to have
Mhm.
some for sure.
Yeah, I like including the smaller sets on there because they're, like you say, they're unblocking top pair, which is going to be a lot of the hands that our opponent bets with. They're unblocking the flush draws that if we check, our button player might bet to just close out the hand there as a semi bluff. And they're hands that, um, if we knew that the player on the button was going to check behind, we would bet them because they benefit from. We don't want to see straights. We don't want to see hearts. Like we have a lot of equity in the hand, but they can withstand a little because it's not like an ace or you're not worried about getting like an overcard coming and proportionally speaking, there's a lot more combos of non-heart overcards than there are hands that are actually going to complete the draws there. So I do like
Yeah,
including.
on the other hand, though, maybe we should be betting fives and sixes because we don't block our opponents from having a jack and calling us.
Right.
So, there's all of those ifs, ands, and buts. Maybe we should be check raising our pocket jacks.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And that's another one of those sort of general rules. And I've probably followed these general rules too carefully. I think I've skewed too far to over towards that. Like I hardly ever bet top set, and I almost always bet middle set and bottom set just for that very reason that it's harder for them to have top pair when you've got top set locked up. But on boards like this, I mean, part of the problem is that there's no, let's use our exact hand of pocket kings, or if we had pocket queens. Like, are there any good turns or rivers at all for us other than hitting our two outs to hit a set ourselves? Like, on a board like this, almost every undercard makes a straight, every heart makes a flush. There is an incentive to be playing our strong hands strongly. Rob?
Well, with the specific hand we have King of Hearts, King of Diamonds. So Ace of Hearts wouldn't really be that bad.
That's true.
The other hearts or the other aces might be bad
Hmm.
because people call with a lot of aces. But the Ace of Hearts isn't really a very bad card for us because it gives us a nut flush draw.
That's a good point.
So I wouldn't be
All right.
afraid of that specific card. And just because another heart comes out doesn't mean somebody has a flush.
Yes, that's true. That's a good point too. That's a good point. Um, all right. Well, again, I feel like we, as often is the
let me
case
just
on
want to add
these.
one thing though. If we
Yeah,
don't bet big here, and another heart does come out, we're probably losing some value because that's a scare card for our opponents as
great
well.
point. Great point. And I guess there's the old, you know, check and evaluate on future streets kind of thing. Like this is one of those situations, or I'm not sure this is one of those situations, but those situations do come up where it's just your equity in the hand depend like there are so many cards that can just absolutely kill your equity in the hand, even if you have a strong hand here. And sometimes the bad event just happens. Like sometimes it's just you're just not going to win this hand. Playing out of position that happens more often. Playing with like a made hand on a dynamic board, that's going to happen more often. Um, so I'm kind of curious. I don't know if Marcel Dusyk, if you're listening, I think you are because you're a regular listener, and thanks for being a member for so long and your support over the years. He's asking, specifically what to do in this spot. And I don't think we're going to give him a perfect answer. But when it comes to sort of how do we decide what to do, um, what are the factors that we're considering? How do we decide which way to blow in the wind? Uh, Rob, Kim, Taylor, any kind of closing thoughts on how we make that decision in real time? It seems like hashtag it depends is going to be the answer a lot. Like a lot of it's just going to be villain dependent. Um, but do you have any like tricks? Do you have any secret little tricks to help people make these decisions more easily, Rob?
No, there's no tricks. It's just understanding, what is the proper strategy, and then trying to get a feel for how your opponents may be deviating from the approved GTO wizard strategy. And as long as you can do that, that's gonna inform what you're gonna do. So you have to make some assumptions about your opponent to start with, and then using what you know about the assumptions of your opponent, helps inform what your action should be.
Yeah, Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, studying these spots is great, and that's why solvers have become so popular. Go into a spot like this, like grab a Jack 5-6 middle position versus button, see what the solver says to do. See how often it says these certain things. Okay, change the 6 from a 6 of hearts to a 6 of spades. Now see how it changes it when there's no flush draw out there. Now change the 6 to a deuce, so it doesn't interact quite as well with certain hands. And like see how solvers kind of change those. And then you can start to do that in your head when you're at the table playing these things in real time and kind of understand some of those different dynamics. How often are they betting big? How often are they betting small? Then the other part of it is, what does your opponent do to react to this? Okay, you bet big. What are they calling with? And then you can start thinking about this. Well, hey, my opponent in this hand, he's way too tight. There's no way he's calling with a gut shot flush draw here. So then start thinking about how does that potentially change your decision making based off that information. That's how I think about it, generally speaking. It's way too much to think about in, 20 seconds when you're trying to decide how to play a hand. But the more you do it, the more you study those different pieces, the easier it gets to get close to the right answer.
And I guess the last general rule that I'll leave our audience with here, the only way that I figure this stuff out, honestly, and Rob and Taylor have both hit on this already, is you study the spots in a vacuum. You find sort of what's the default, what's the textbook way to play these according to these, the assumptions that everyone's a bot. All this GTO stuff, it just assumes that everyone's playing perfectly. And you get a solution assuming that players are playing perfectly. When I'm thinking about player types, usually the kind of language I use in my mind as I'm tagging them is what kind of errors does this player make? What are the ways that they're going to deviate from the correct play the most often? Is it by overcalling? Is it by being too aggressive and raising with hands that they shouldn't? Is it by overfolding? And then I let that guide me completely when it comes to these spots. I honestly, especially in the games that we're playing, I think Andrew Brokus said it best. I don't know if it was when he was on our show or if it was in one of his books, but he said, when they move an inch, we move a mile. And that's the way I approach this kind of tiebreaker, this sort of, there's these competing elements. Which decision should I make? Which is the right general rule to follow? Generally, the general rule to follow in spots like this, where there's a lot of competing factors, is what are the opponent's mistakes going to be? What are the kinds of mistakes they're going to make? And then if you're in a quandary, if you're having trouble finding like the textbook solution for how to play balanced in a spot like this, just play it in a way that leads into your opponent's mistakes. If you've got a value hand, bet it. Don't worry about getting too tricky and checking. And like, if you think this is the kind of player that's just going to call passively and they're not going to get out of line, like, then that promotes a whole bunch of the cusp hands that we've been talking about into value bets and value bet more thinly. And you don't have to worry about getting raised and like having to fold out your equity on spots like that. If it's a very aggressive opponent that's going to raise too frequently, that changes the whole dynamic. Yeah, we're checking a lot more frequently, and we're putting a lot of those very strong hands in our check raising or even our check calling buckets because we want to give our opponent more rope to give it out on future streets. So it sounds silly, like we kind of said at the very beginning, like it depends and it's very villain dependent. But the one thought, if I could leave you with, is if you're having trouble deciding like which general rule to follow, don't just play against the player in the hand. And it's going to be harder when you're going to be out of position. It's going to be harder multi-way. Yeah, poker's kind of hard sometimes, it turns out. Sorry, folks, this just in. You're going to have a ton of difficult decisions, even when you've solved all this stuff out. Even the solvers don't know what to do. They play these mixed strategies. If you look at the outputs, hardly ever are the solver outputs like, oh, just do this, kid, you'll be fine. No, no, no. They're like, oh, do this 40% of the time, this 60% of the time. Ask them how to choose. They can't choose. You shouldn't have to choose. Just do your best. And let your opponents make bigger mistakes than you and more mistakes than you. And when in doubt, just try and make your opponent make the kind of mistakes that they want to make. You know, a lot of these weaker players, they want to overcall, they want to overfold, they want to overraise. So I'd let them. All right. Well, Rob, Kim, Taylor, any parting thoughts? I want to thank Marcel Dusyk for putting this together. Bone Crusher 14 on Discord. If you're listening along and you want to get involved, sign up for a free account at RecPoker. Like I mentioned, all it takes is an email address and a smile, although we do insist on both. But the forums, the Discord, the home games, all the free strategy videos that we do, our social events, there's just a million fun things to get involved. And if you want to get more involved in our premium membership, like I say, just either make a donation of any amount to a local food bank and let us know, or drop $5 on your first month of premium membership by using the code RecPoker at checkout. I think that you'll really benefit from it, and you'll find some folks here that you just love talking poker with. So I hope you do. All right, Rob Washam, Kim Kilroy, Taylor Moss, Bone Crusher, Marcel, this has been a treat. All you listeners at home, thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next week on the RecPoker Podcast. Oh, and Running Aces, you're the best, Running Aces. Thanks for all your support. Bye.